The Indian public sector banks, with over 10 lakh employees and with around 80,000 branches spread across the length and breadth of our nation, has served both the rich and the poor, the rural and the urban, and people from all walks of life equally for almost 49 years now. The role of our public sector banks in transforming India from a primitive third world economy to a fast-growing modern economy is very crucial. The amount of loan distributed by the state-owned banks still amounts to almost 70% of the total loans, even after massive privatization which started after the early 90s.
And between 69 and 1991, what happened? The country was transformed. Lot of development took place. Agriculture grew. The production increased. White revolution in milk, green revolution in agriculture, blue revolution in fishery. Everything was because of the banking sector support. IRDP, which was considered as the largest ever poverty alleviation program in the world, was a successful program. There were some failures, there were some politicization, but by and large, there are studies to show that it really transformed the life of the poorest of the poor in the country.
The story of India's banking system hasn't always been this optimistic, and in fact, after independence, the Indian banking system, which was predominantly in the hands of private players, was in a complete mess. Between 1947 and 1969, a total of 736 banks failed in India. This was also a time when banking services were totally denied to the nation's rural population and agriculture sector in particular. Too much privatization and the non-inclusive nature of the private sector banks during the late 60s resulted in the total failure of India's banking sector and also the overall nation's economy as a whole. This forced the government to nationalize the banking sector in July 19, 1969. After nationalization, the general public's confidence in our country's banking system improved remarkably, and naturally they started depositing more and more money in our banks. The Indian banks thus started growing rapidly in size after nationalization and became more and more stable. As our public sector banks grew in size, simultaneously they also propelled the growth of the nation's industries, agriculture, and other key sectors as well. In June 1969, before nationalization, there were only 1,833 rural and 3,342 semi-urban offices of the banks. By March 1991, these figures rose to 35,206 rural offices and 11,344 semi-urban offices. The 2 decades post-nationalization can be called the golden era for the public sector banks and for our nation's economy as a whole. It is the overall public character of our banking system that saved our nation's banking sector during 2009, when the whole world was in a serious economic recession and when the giant international banks were falling down one after the other.
Have not the foreign banks collapsed during the 2008 subprime lending crisis? They were some of the best private banks. Some of the best independent private directors were on those boards. 2011 crisis of Europe and the present crisis, the spillover of all those crises, it was a financial tsunami. How many banks collapsed there? But if you, about 465 banks collapsed during the subprime lending crisis and thereafter. In India also, how many private sector banks have collapsed? I don't want to name them. But can you tell me one public sector bank that has collapsed during the financial crisis of the world? Has one public sector bank being this thing? Public sector banks have stood tall Economists all over the world have acknowledged the role of public sector banks, the role, conservative policies of the RBI many a times, the habit of savings of the people, and more importantly, the role played by the trade unions in the country in protecting the public sector character.
But today, after the implementation of privatization and aggressive pro-corporate neoliberal policies, the public sector banks are in the middle of a serious crisis. More than ever before, now it is very important to not forget the lessons of the past, to remember what too much unregulated privatization can do to our economy and to the banking sector. The fact remains very clear. Public sector banks are service-oriented and private sector banks are not. This is why it is the public's duty to protect our public sector banks.